Good afternoon and welcome to Ideas at Ford. I'm Darren Walker, president of the Ford Foundation. I am a brown-skinned African-American man who is bald with lucite glasses, a blue blazer, a blue and white shirt, and my pronouns are he and him. I'm sitting in my office here at the Ford Foundation, and I am thrilled, ecstatic to present to you a friend, an icon, Professor Anita Hill, whose book, Believing, a 30-year journey to end gender violence, is a gift. We're going to talk to Professor Hill about this gift. But before we do that, I just want to welcome you, Anita, to Ideas at Ford and tell you that I feel so lucky to be able to be with you today. And I know the hundreds of people who are gathered are eagerly anticipating this conversation. Welcome, Professor Anita Hill.
Well, thank you, Mr. Walker. I am just delighted to be here. I'm Anita Hill. My pronouns are she, her. I'm coming to you from Waltham, Massachusetts. I'm sitting in front of a tan wall and in my home, and I'm wearing a bright red floral blouse because I wanted to bring some fire to my evening conversation with the marvelous Darren Walker. Um, let's see, what else can I tell you about myself? I am a dark-skinned Black woman, and I wear glasses that I've worn since I was 6 years old. So I'm helpless without them. But I am also very grateful to be able to uh, not see you, but to be here present with you today. I'm excited about this conversation. I'll tell you it's for a number of reasons. One, because I know what wonderful work the Ford Foundation does and what wonderful leadership it has under Darren Walker. And I've been a beneficiary of that leadership in many, many ways. Darren has been a great friend. He's been a wonderful mentor. He's been someone.
Oh, hardly. Oh, we're not here to talk about me. We're here to talk about you, Professor Anita Hill.
Well, but I think people should know that we are, all the wonderful things that you've said about me, you have encouraged and helped me grow into. So I will leave it at that.
Thank you. Thank you very much. A compliment from an icon. But let me just say, my friend, Professor Anita Hill, you are an icon, but you are a reluctant icon. At least in your book, you make it clear that you're actually a shy person by nature.
Yes. Well, I had to overcome some of my shyness when I started teaching, which was about not quite 40 years ago, but almost 40 years ago. So when you get up in front of a classroom, you're kind of really exposed. I am a shy person. I'm a reserved person and a quiet person. I come at it through my mother, who was also very quiet. And actually, my father's mother was quiet. So genetically, I think I'm inclined toward being shy and quiet. But, there's sometimes when you can't remain quiet. Even those of us who are shy or think of ourselves as reserved have to speak up when it's our time to speak up and to be present and to give voice to some of the people who cannot speak for themselves or don't have the platform that we have. So you overcome that and you do what you need to do. And in my case, I'm doing what I feel I was called to do.
Well, you were called reluctantly. You became, of course, in 1992, a global name, a name that was recognized across the world, around the world, when you were reluctant, you were not seeking to be in the public eye, to sit before that committee of senators, the Judiciary Committee, and yet you were there and were the epitome of grace, of courage, of character and integrity. And I'll never forget the visual of you and behind you, your mother and father, the siblings, your community of working folk, not dressed in designer clothes, clearly not accustomed to sitting in such rarefied air, and yet they gave dignity to the room. And before we get into this book, I just want to say, I know I speak for everyone listening to your words today in saying it was at that moment that your status as an icon, a warrior for justice, in the words of Dr. King, was solidified. And those of us who have watched you since that time have looked on with awe in the way in which you have comported yourself in the face of malicious attacks, in the face of misrepresentations and mischaracterizations, and yet you have prevailed and have been able to write this book, which is, you truly have put everything on the table in this book. Courage, conviction. It is a tour de force. And I want to talk about why you felt the need to write this book now.
Well, I first want to say thank you for recognizing my family and my parents. And when I look back at that picture of us, I do see their dignity. I see also their integrity. And that's what I've tried to reflect in through all of my work. It was what, I say when I walked in the Senate hearing. I might have been nervous, but once I knew who I had behind me, I didn't need to be worried because they had always been behind me and they showed me how to meet this moment. They'd shown me throughout their lives how to meet this moment.
Well, you had been raised by parents, as you said, you talk about in the book, your mother, your grandmother, your father, and there's clearly, what I didn't understand is you had 12 siblings.
All older.
How was it possible for two parents to have enough love to go around for 12, 13 children?
Well, that's the amazing thing about my parents. I never heard my parents, either one of them, say to any of us that you should be more like your brother, your sister, or they were all so open to letting us be who we were and not trying to make us like one or the other of us, which allowed us to find ourselves. And still have the core values that they taught us, but to be ourselves with those values. And I think it's a great testament to parenting. That they
parenting 13 children?
Yeah. Well, I don't have children, so now you can understand that I think it sort of says a lot about me, but also, growing up with 12 siblings was a gift. And I think my parents thought having 13 children was really a gift. They, they all, they both lived long enough, long lives, my parents did, but they never lost a child. And so, I could talk about my parents all night, and and you'll probably hear occasionally their names dropped again. But um, what I keep saying is that what I have had in terms of growing up, in terms of being in rural Oklahoma and growing up on that farm and really understanding that you had to be there for each other and that you had to be there for other people, some of whom in that community were we were not wealthy. In fact, our farm was a subsistence farm, but there were people who were not as well off as we were. Maybe they didn't have enough food or clothes. And my mom and dad were always generous, especially my mom in terms of the food that she would share with people. Anything that she had that she would share. And it had taught me about what we're supposed to do on this earth is to be willing to share with others. The other thing that they taught me was that you have a role in the world, and God has given you a lot, even though He hasn't given you everything that you get. He's given you a lot to work with, and you should use whatever gifts you have to share and to improve the world.
Well, they clearly gave you the foundation that allowed you to navigate treacherous waters. You write this book and you include in it the experience of receiving phone calls, receiving incoming that could be malicious, harassing, and you get a call that you assume might be one such call, and you pick up the phone, and this person starts a long, long story that in many ways is a metaphor for why you had to write this book. What happened when you received that call? When was it? Why did it happen?
Well, it was 30 years ago. It was in days of the hearing, and I was still hurting badly from the experience of testifying before the Senate Judiciary Committee. I was getting threats. I was getting harassing calls and mail, every day. And so when the phone rang in the afternoon, I was sitting in my office. I almost didn't answer it. I almost just, I was tempted to let it go to voicemail, but something told me to pick up the phone. And the person on the other end started very slowly and in a voice that, was half, sort of scary and sort of half very vulnerable. Um, and one of the first things that he said to me was, um, after asking if I was Anita Hill, he said, "You've opened up a whole can of worms." And I didn't really know what he was going to say next. I didn't know whether he was going to lambast me or testifying, whether he was going to question my integrity or my motives or my character in other ways. I just didn't know what was going to come. But what came was his story. I had expected to hear from people about stories of sexual harassment, which is what I had testified to. And I expected to hear from women, which I had. I'd heard from a number of women, but this was one of the first phone calls that I'd heard from a man. And his story was not about sexual harassment, but it was about incest. And what he was telling me was that sexual harassment really was only one issue, one behavior that we experience because of our gender. And his story was about experiencing incest. But he even went on further and he thought about it clearly. He said he watched the Senate hearings and he looked at the treatment that I had received from the members of the committee, the hostilities and the aggression that I had experienced. He looked at it in much the same way as he looked at the treatment he'd received from his parents when he told them that he had been abused by a family member. And he went on to say that they completely dismissed him, they rejected it, they took the side of his abuser, and that it had stayed with him, but that watching the hearing helped him understand his parents' reaction, that it wasn't really him that they were reacting to. They were reacting to a number of lies and stories that they had been hearing probably all of their lives, and myths and tropes about abusers and blaming victims for their own abuse that, were bigger than him, bigger than me, and had to be dealt with as a cultural and social problem, not just as an individual concern. And so it was then that I realized that I had stepped into something that I didn't know enough about. I had testified before the Senate Judiciary Committee because I felt it was my duty as a lawyer, as a member of the bar, to provide information about the character and fitness of an individual who was in a position to be for a lifetime tenure on the highest court in the country. But the issue of gender violence that he was talking about, the can of worms that he was referring to, is much bigger than any one seat on the Supreme Court or one individual witness. And so it was that day that I realized that I needed to be thinking bigger and broader and more inclusively about what was going on in the world and what had happened to me as part of it.
And as you say in the book, you actually over time have received just a deluge of traumatic stories and letters and calls flooding your mailbox, your telephone. You've got file cabinets full of correspondence from people telling you about this kind of violence.
And his was just one of the heartbreaking stories, whether the stories are about abuse, incest, whether they're about bullying, whether they're about rape and sexual assault, intimate partner violence. Some of the stories have happy endings. So, for example, I was in Kansas City once, and this woman I was signing books, and she came up to me. Her turn in line came up, and she said, with a smile on her face, she said, "I left my husband because of you." And I thought, well, okay, let's hear the rest of this story. And she said that she had been in an abusive marriage for years at the time of the hearings. When she heard the hearings, when she heard what I had to say, even when she saw the senator's reaction, she knew she had to get out of that relationship. And she did. And she had the help of family and friends who supported her. And I thought, if every, not every story, well, I'd love for every story, but if one more story and more stories could have this happy ending, they don't all end that way. I mean, the incest story was a story of struggle that was ongoing to understand his situation. But what I realize every time I hear the stories of success like this woman had, I realize that there is a possibility of liberating people from their pain. But
this is what's so great about
the book. Different way.
Well, yeah. And this is what's so great about the book, that what you do is you not only tell these stories and put this movement that you clearly are a leader in a frame, but you also put forth a set of solutions. So the book is not just diagnostic. you say, in order to really address these issues, we need to enact, we need to engage in these ways. And so I think that that is also unusual. So often the books are cathartic in that they allow people to have their grief, their anguish, their pain, those stories told, but they're not followed up with, and here are the things that we as a society need to do, which is what you do in your book, which I think is so powerful.
Well, and I wanted to tell the stories, not as they, as some people call it, a pornography of trauma. I wanted to tell the stories in a way that was dignified and gave voice to the pain and suffering that people experience, because I think we still, as a culture, need to acknowledge that pain. I think so often we still fall back on these old tropes like, well, it's not so bad. And we tell people who are suffering, we tell people who have been abused, well, that wasn't so bad. I mean, or we tell them, maybe you shouldn't make a big deal out of it. Um, and what I wanted the reader to first take away from is just an acknowledgement of the problem that we have, and to realize that we, in many ways, participate or are complicit with the problem by the way that we engage with survivors and victims, the ways that we dismiss them and even altogether deny their claims, or even blame them. Even once we accept that their claims are truthful, we often blame them for it. And I don't think that's intentional, but I think it's so much a part of our culture of denial and silencing that we do it, even though we have every good intention and want to be supportive.
Well, and I think I thought that the chapter on Black women was especially compelling, and it just reminded me of how throughout time the words, the genius, the analysis and perspective and plight of Black women was dismissed, has been dismissed. And I think about Phyllis Wheatley, the great Phyllis Wheatley, one of America's great poets, and how upon reading her poetry, John Adams and Thomas Jefferson both rejected the idea that a Black woman could have penned these words. And sometimes I think that you experienced that this, brilliant Yale-educated lawyer, we're going to dismiss her. She can't be that fabulous. And yet, you talk about in the chapter on the Black women, just the complexity within the race, Black women, the dimensions of Black, white, and then how everyone is harmed by these stereotypes. Talk a little bit about why you felt it was important to write about that.
Well, first of all, with the dismissiveness of me, I don't think anybody expected me to be around this long. The media, people in the media told me, oh, well, your story will be over in a couple of months and nobody will remember who you are. And I think that was, frankly, what some of the people in the Senate want. And I put that in, in terms of history and the experiences of other Black women. There was a wonderful ad that was brought out by a group of Black feminists, African American women in defense of ourselves, that now is a poster that I hope people will take a look at. But basically, what it comes down to is that we are not allowed to be authorities of our own experiences, or authorities on our own experiences. We are told in settings like the Senate Judiciary Committee and other places, like when we complain about violence and abuse, we are told that our story isn't relevant, or it needs to take second place to some other kind of bias or discrimination. We are told that we have to wait our turn to be heard. And in many cases, we are shamed into remaining silent because we are told that by telling our stories, we will be bringing shame to our community. And that was something that happened to me, but it's happened over and over in history. I mean, and this unwillingness to give us, like Phyllis Wheatley couldn't have possibly written such beautiful poetry, or when Harriet Jacobs wrote about the way that she was abused, her authority was questioned, that this could not have been her writing, that somebody had put her up to this. And so we are silenced in a variety of ways. But it comes to me in contemporary terms because from 1991, after I testified, even until today, you know, just months ago or weeks ago, probably, I hear from young Black women who can't complain about abuse that they're experiencing because they're afraid of bringing more policing, more shame, or more racism onto the community. And I hear from women who have gone to the police about a sexual assault or rape, and their claims aren't investigated. Or in fact, some of them feel like they are being treated as criminals. Um, but on the other hand, I have to say, and this is where it gets sort of nuanced and complex, is I hear from young African American men who want to be part of this anti-gender violence movement, either because of their own experiences or experiences of people they love. And they are hesitant because they have to live with the racial and sexualized stigma that go along with being Black male. They have to deal with the racism and criminalization of their behavior just by their existence, and so this is a very complex problem. We know that the rates of injury and harm and violence are higher for Black women. They're higher for trans Black women. The statistics over and over tell you that race is a component, and so we've got to deal with racism if we're going to be able to eliminate gender violence. We have to deal with both at the same time.
We're going to go to questions in a moment, but I have to take you back to Sundance, where the film on the documentary on Anita Hill premiered to a standing ovation. People were yelling and cheering from the rafters. That documentary was so powerful, and of course, it was so critically received and reviewed. And but the opening of that documentary was among the most powerful openings of a social justice documentary I've ever seen. And the opening begins with a phone call, with a voicemail. And it is the voice of the wife of Justice Clarence Thomas. And it is a long and rambling voicemail. And the message is somewhat incoherent, but clear in seeking to certainly continue the harassment and the sense that you must feel of people wanting to make you uncomfortable. How How does Anita Hill deal with a moment like that?
Well, I will give kudos to Freedom Up for her film in that documentary. And I will tell you that going through the process of making that documentary helped me um, to deal with how do I feel about that moment, and and also that happened maybe 10 years ago. It took me about 20 years probably to get to where I understood that call. I understood that call as another way of shaming, as a way of shaming and making me feel guilty for coming forward in 1991 and placing blame on me. And I assume that she hoped that it would stick, but by 2011, when the phone call came in, I was done with that. I wasn't even, I wasn't the certainly the 25-year-old that was harassed on the workplace, and I wasn't the 35-year-old even who testified reluctantly about it. I had grown in many ways since then. And I keep coming back to the stories and the need for platforms and the need to give voice to different experiences. But it was even during that time when I was in Sundance. Um, I remember at one point a couple of women came and identified themselves as Native women, and they told me about the number of missing and dead women in tribes on tribal lands across the country, people who've just disappeared and people have not been able to find loved ones. And they had driven 4 hours to get there. So even in that moment when I was celebrating that film, I was still hearing from people and opening up new avenues or new issues that I knew we have to deal with. That's how I deal with it. That's how I deal with attempts to shame me now or the harassing calls that I get now. I deal with it by just, doubling down on the work and my willingness and opportunity that I have to expose the issues for what they are and to, as you say, work on ways to solve them as opposed to continuing this and passing along from generation to generation.
Well, we're going to go to questions because the audience is eager to ask you questions, Professor Hill. So my colleague, Katie, is going to facilitate.
Great. Thank you so much. So first question from the audience. In some ways, Christine Blasey Ford's testimony at the Kavanaugh hearing felt like a repeat of your experience. Can you talk about how you felt witnessing Dr. Ford's testimony, and have you spoken with her?
I had not spoken with Christine Blasey Ford before she testified, but I have spoken with her since. I met her in person uh, a year or so ago. And, actually, it's maybe almost 2 years ago. Um, and we have spoken, and really, I think, and people may have this different perception of what that conversation should be like or might have been like. But really, I related to her as a human. That's what it was. It was about how are you doing? How are you dealing with the experience that maybe I, in some ways, am the one person who knows how it feels. But I'm also the one person who knows that it will get better. I when she testified, it was 27 years since my testimony, and certainly I have changed and grown and have a much better understanding and perspective. And she was in that process, very early in that process. But I assured her that things were going to get better. And I think she understands that now, better 2 years later, but she still, as she said recently to me in a podcast, that she still feels like she has a way to go.
Great. The next question, social media and the use of hashtags like Me Too or Why I Left have given voice to countless people who've been otherwise silenced. What are your thoughts on the role that social media plays when it comes to the issue of gender-based violence?
Well, social media has played a wonderful role with those hashtags and many others that are have been come into place so that more inclusiveness is part of what the conversation. I mean, more people are included, different genders, different sexual identities are included in the conversation. It's helped people to galvanize. It's helped affirm people's experiences to be a part of that conversation on social media, and it has raised awareness. I mean, with the Me Too movement alone, 19 million tweets stand for something, and the fact that it sort of caught on all over the globe suggests to you how much energy there is, and then people have had enough, that they're willing and ready to tell their stories in some form or fashion. On the other hand, social media um, can be a negative, because we know that those same platforms are used to torment and harass people. And that, I talk about it in the book, and the statistics are that women of color face the most, or at least a higher level of social media harassment and abuse than others. And so, it's a two-way, it's a two-edged sword. But I think where it's most troublesome is among middle school children, where 34% of middle school children report that they have been exposed to or had directed at them some form of harassment and abuse, whether it's racism, sexism, homophobism, on social media. So, we have to really balance the good that social media does with the bad. And we need to look at that as a whole, as an issue to address if we are going to get our arms around the problem of how abuse and bias is and violence gets communicated.
Next question is, what would you tell 25-year-old you today?
Yeah, I've been asked that question. I would tell the 25-year-old me that to be patient. That when I was 25 years old, even with what happened to me in my job working with Clarence Thomas, even with that, I really believe that we were headed toward more equality. Whether it was racism or sexism or gender identity or sexuality, or I thought we were on the road to get there when I was 25 years old. And maybe it was idealism coming out of law school. I don't know what it was, but there it was. And I don't know that I was patient. I thought it was going to happen and be over with, and we could all get on with the rest of our lives. But now I know that, even at 25 years old, you need to be patient. You have to think of it, think of it in the long game. Not this quick sprint to solving the world's problems. You have to be patient with yourself and realize that sometimes you have to move across the country, which I've had to get where you need to be able to be your most effective self.
Right, our next question. A lot has changed recently, but there's a lot more we all need to do. What specific changes would you like to see happen, not only in government and on a policy level, but also in workplaces, schools, communities, to combat gender violence?
Well, let me just start at the top because there are a bunch of answers that I think I could give to that. But I'll start with the top. I think, first of all, our leadership, whether it's in Washington, D.C., whether it's the president of the United States or the CEO of a major corporation or a smaller corporation or the president or chancellor of a university, I think all of us, all of those leaders need to acknowledge the depth and the pervasiveness and the harm that is being caused through this whole range of gender violence that I talk about in the book. First, we got to acknowledge it, because if you don't acknowledge it, you're not going to fix it. It can't be a priority if you can't even say out loud to people that this is a huge problem and I'm recognizing it as one. So, that is the start. And I think from there, you can start talking about changing the policies and structure. But what role do we have, all of us? Our role, in some ways, is to check our own behavior. And it may be that the role of leaders is to change the policies and structures and the systems. But the role of all of us is to change the culture. And we can start really with elementary school, because there is a whole range of behaviors that are happening to children that fall under the category of gender violence, whether from really violent and harmful and aggressive bullying to sexual harassment to sexual assault in our middle schools and secondary schools especially. And we tend to think, well, we'll put all of that burden to fix it on the students themselves, but the students are suffering; they're vulnerable, and retaliation and for people who speak out is harsh even in that level. So we need to talk to the teachers, talk to principals, talk to our superintendents, put pressure really on all of our leaders to address this issue wherever they find their own constituents in their own leadership.
Well, speaking of leaders, I appreciate that in the book you address our president, who many have said over the years owes you a very big apology as the former chairman of the Senate Judiciary Committee. And it seems that he did reach out to you, and you reflect on that outreach very graciously in the book, I would say, without any recrimination, very graciously.
Yes, well, we had a conversation and I got an apology for me personally. It came about 28 years after. It took a while, but I'm a patient woman. But this is what I'm not patient for. The apology was one thing, and I had worked through so much before I got it that it wasn't the only thing that I wanted. What I really wanted was solution. I wanted, as I said, somebody to acknowledge the problem, that it was bigger than his behavior, but in 1991, but it wasn't bigger than his responsibility as the man at the time who wanted to be president. And it was we talked about his support of the Violence Against Women Act, and also some campaign against sexual assault on college campuses. All work that I applaud. But the problem's not over yet. The problem's not solved. And right now, I'm not looking to blame. I'm looking for accountability and recognition of a responsibility, not only to all of the people I've talked about, but to the people in the military who are suffering from them. the people who are not direct victims, but who have lost faith in our institutions, like our military, or like our courts, or like our FBI, who that failed the victims of Larry Nassar so spectacularly. And comes from testimony that we heard just last month about how the FBI, even after hearing about complaints from children who had been abused by Larry Nassar, failed to even follow up with an investigation, leaving 70 to 100 more victims that followed after the complaints were given to the authorities. So, as president, you should restore our confidence in those systems by acting, not by words, not by apologies, but by acting to resolve them.
Thank you. Katie.
So our next question, who are the people or organizations now doing work on gender-based violence that are giving you hope?
Well, there's so many organizations that have sprung up. There are organizations for restaurant workers that experience, tremendous harassment and typically are working on tipped wages and don't, sort of have to put up with a certain amount of harassment just because that's the only way that they're going to be earning a workable wage. And so there are organizations that are working to protect people who are doing domestic work. There's a small organization that I'm going to be speaking with later in this series of talks that I've been giving, Girls for Gender Equity, that's working in schools to address these problems with schools and with the students who are in them, and empowering the students to work. Those are all efforts. I'm on the board of National Women's Law Center, and we are
Board grantee, yay!
yes, the center is doing great work, and their leadership in all of these. And I always have hesitant to start listing things because specific, even though I'll list the center, because there's so many that are doing good work that I know I'll leave out people, but I really encourage those of you out there who haven't taken up this issue to look for organizations in your community or look at the national organizations to find ways to support their work, because it is important. Philanthropy for gender issues is increasing, but it's fallen short of the needs for resources.
Great, and I think we have time for one more question. So what do you believing, and what can we do next?
Well, I want, when people read this book and when they sit down and not only read it, but maybe have conversations about it, I want them to really believe in the value of women. I mean, because that's at the start. The reason that this violence has been allowed and tolerated in many cases is because we don't really appreciate the value that we bring to the world. We are, not appreciated, as I said, to be authorities on our own lives, and so I would say that I want people to believe that we are valuable and that we deserve better. And finally, I want people to really believe in change. That change is possible, and I honestly, I've seen it happen in my lifetime. My mom this coming Saturday, if she had lived, she'd be 110 years old. And I saw in my mom's life the things that have changed had changed from when she was born in 1911 to, when she passed. Um, and so I know that change is possible. It's not complete, but it is possible. And I'll just end with one story. In terms of what I do, I really do feel that I'm exactly where I should be. Um, it doesn't mean that I won't grow. It doesn't mean that I won't try to get stronger, but I feel like I'm on the path that I should be on. But I am not sure that I would have gotten here in the same way or with the same sense of urgency as I have if it hadn't been for a talk that I had with high school students in a vo-tech school in California when a young man, a teenager, high school student, stepped up to the mic in the cafeteria where we were all set up and said to me, "How does it feel to know that you've changed the world?" And even to that moment, and that was just about 10 years ago, I don't know that I felt like I had changed the world. But I knew at that moment that I'd have to do everything that I could to try to change it. And so that's where I am, and that's where I will continue to be.
And that is why you are so admired. And I have to say, many people know you, have followed your career, have followed your trajectory. But I also want to just reflect on the part of you that people don't necessarily get to see, that I have seen. For example, a couple of years ago, walking about Venice, Italy with your beloved Chuck, looking at art because you love Mark Bradford's work and you were in Venice, you love art. And it was so great, Anita, to see you in that context and to see how joyous you and Chuck were and what just a great vibe of energy you brought. It was just fantastic.
Well, thank you. And I also have a sense of humor, which people don't necessarily
Yes,
know about
exactly.
me.
And we won't even talk about the cocktails and the humor that we got to experience that night. But I do want to end on something because you clearly your parents, their faith, it was profound and foundational for you. And I love in the book where you talk about people saying to you over the years, "Oh my goodness, it must have been so difficult. It must have been so hard. I admire you." But you write that looking back on it, a line from a gospel song I heard many times as a child stands out. Quote, "I wouldn't take nothing for my journey now," end quote. That said it all. That said it all.
Yeah.
Thank you, Professor Anita Hill, for this gift. I commend this book to all of you watching. It will absolutely be a book to remember. And you will want it on your bookshelves in the years to come as a resource and as a marker of history in this moment. I want to thank Professor Anita Hill for being with me on Ideas at Ford. And we have coming up a big program for the rest of the year teed up. Next, on October 18th, Professor Abhijit Banerjee and Esther Duflo, followed on the 25th by Anne Marie Slaughter at the Center for New America, and finally Jillian Tatt with her new book, Anthrovision. It's going to be a big lineup, and I am delighted that you're all going to be with us. Thank you so much for joining us at Ideas and Ford. And again, thank you, Anita Hill.
Thank you for a wonderful evening.